Hello, this is Jay Mitchell, and we are back with another episode of the Libertarian Uncensored podcast, going over all the posts on Libertarian Uncensored subreddit. Let's get right into it. So first we have, ICE is bringing military occupation and recruitment tactics to America from Reason.com, posted by Jedi Porcupine. And yeah, personally, I don't really care for that, but ultimately the U.S. government can justify whatever it wants to justify regards to the use of force. And Reddit cares since ICE is an out-group agency, but I'm sure if it was an in-group agency that was fighting against like transphobia or something, Reddit would think it's the greatest thing ever. So ultimately, people usually don't care. Usually only care about the state, the authority of the state when it has the wrong letter next to its name, and this is a good example of that. Next we have, ICE officers are taking DNA samples from protesters they've arrested from NPR.org, posted by FlimsyAl5563. Yeah, personally, I don't think they should be doing that, especially if it's not consensual. But, ultimately, they're in a position of state authority to pretty much justify whatever they want to, and oftentimes there's nothing you can do about it. Next, we have FDA announced outbreak investigation of E. coli linked to raw cheddar cheese, posted by Ragnar OKXG, and that looks like a screenshot of a tweet from Fact Post, who tweeted, the FDA has announced at least 7 people have contracted E. coli linked to cheddar cheese made from raw milk, and then it looks like they're quoting another guy from named Such Nerve, who tweeted, I can understand what the big deal is with pasteurization. It's literally just heating milk for a set time when they're rapidly cooling it, no chemicals, no high-tech equipment, it's just heating milk. And then the OPAD source, and I guess it's linked in FDA.gov, from FDA.gov on that story. And yeah, personally, I think the libertarian position on raw milk is the same if anything, if you want to put that into your body, you should be able to, the same with any illicit drugs or alcohol or pretty much anything. Ultimately, whatever you want to put into your body is your choice. The libertarian position is very much be against the war on drugs and any illegal materials. Ultimately, whether you want to drink raw milk or not, that's your choice. I guess you have an argument that what about children? What if their parents give them raw milk? Ultimately, parents can give their children whatever food they feel like, and sometimes there's nothing you can do about it. I don't think parents. I personally don't know if parents should be giving their kids raw milk or like heroin or anything. But ultimately, people are just about to justify, and yeah, ultimately, I think the libertarian position is, do whatever you want for your own body, and maybe you can get, if you want to justify giving your kids whatever you want to feel like, or not giving them whatever they feel like, you don't feel like vaccinating them, for instance, you shouldn't be forced to do so, but ultimately, justify whatever you want to justify, and if you want to do raw milk, or think it's the best thing ever, you should be able to. If you don't want to do it and think it's the worst thing ever, you should be able to. Same with pretty much anything else involving things you put into your body, like vaccines or alcohol or drugs or any of that. And that's my thoughts on that issue. Next we have, what do you think the outcome will be the outcome of the Israel/US war waged in Iran, posted by Acadian Academic. And yeah, personally, I think that eventually things will settle down and people will move on to whatever the next thing is. I remember back in the 2000s, nobody could stop talking about the Iraq War, but eventually people moved on to whatever the next thing was, and that's very much how history and social media in particular also works. It's always whatever the current thing is. Next we have, why do people still subscribe to and read the New York Times, posted by Donald Key, and that's a cross post from the Blue Sky Skeets subreddit. And that looks like a Blue Sky post from Matt Negrin, who tweeted, NYT admits their sexism drives coverage of AOC. They edit Trump to make him look good and put ums in AOC's quotes to make her look bad, because when Trump says words like that's nothing, not noteworthy, but when AOC does it, it's striking. And yeah, personally, I think the libertarian position is, ultimately all media sources are entitled to the same level of base trust from the public, whether they be the New York Times or InfoWars. 0. If you want to believe everything the New York Times says, you should be able to. If you don't believe everything the InfoWars says, you should be able to, but you shouldn't be forced to believe anything they say if you don't want to. And ultimately, I would say the thing with the legacy media like the New York Times or ABC or CBS or NPR, or pretty much any regime media, I guess you could say also, is that, they only exist to push narratives. I mean, everyone's going to push a narrative regardless of what media they're using. If I can push a narrative through this podcast, for instance, and I'm definitely not nearly as big as the New York Times when it comes to being a media source. But, ultimately, people are going to justify saying whatever they want to say. If you want to believe them, you should be able to, but you should always be skeptical of whatever people are trying to say, regardless of what outlet they're working for. And personally, I think the New York Times, I think, us as a society have kind of moved past that, the need for stuff like the New York Times and other traditional legacy media sources, since now we have social media to communicate with each other, like YouTube, X, Reddit, and all that. Why do we still need traditional legacy media as well? And I think as the decades go on, we'll increasingly see them become increasingly irrelevant and slow and probably bankrupt and thrown into the dustbin of history. And that's my thoughts on that issue. Next, we have government shutdowns won't stop airport security if airport security isn't run by the government, from Reason.com, posted by Jedi Porcupine. And yeah, personally, I think the libertarian position is, if airport security, if it's private, it's fine. If it's tied to, but if the government is forcing it on you, I don't think that's very libertarian. I think the libertarian position is, if you want to get all examined by the TSA and all that, you should be able to, but I don't think you should be forced to do so if you don't want to. And I think that's very much the libertarian position on pretty much everything. If you want to do something, you should be able to. If you don't want to do something, you shouldn't be forced to do so. I guess if you have a few exceptions for that, like if you want to, like, let's say, attack a school, for instance. I personally don't think you should be doing that, but people are going to justify whatever they want to justify. If they want to justify violating the non-aggression principle, ultimately they'll justify that. And yeah, personally, I think as long as libertarian, as long as you aren't hurting anyone else, you should be able to do whatever you want. And that's my thoughts on that issue. Next, we have Paleos hate the left more than they hate the state. Example 42067, posted by, and that's a tweet from post from Gen Z, and that's a screenshot of a tweet from Tom Woods. What's the price of the war? Lives lost, money squandered, absolutely. But think of the absolute worst things the left can do when they're back in power. Those are the cost. And no, this dumb thing sure as hell ain't worth that. And I'd agree with that. Reddit, of course, always makes defenses for the left, while always going after anything right-coded with the full extent of their wrath. But, ultimately, I think the libertarian position is you gotta call up both left-wing and right-wing authoritarianism. I do think some paleos like Tom Woods do have some difficulty calling out right-wing authoritarianism, but, ultimately, I would say it's much, much more worse when it comes to Reddit leftists calling out left-wing authoritarianism. If something like the Soviet Union or the Khmer Rouge were to happen today, Reddit would probably find a way to justify it, and I don't think that's very libertarian. If you want to justify mass murder from the state, you justify whatever you want. But, ultimately, I don't think it's libertarian, regardless of whether it's left-coded or right-coded, and that's my thoughts on that issue. Next, we have Hayek. The ideals of socialism and social justice are an atavism, a vain attempt to impose the morals of the tribal society, posted by Lemon Limelight, and they said, an interesting perspective from Friedrich Hayek on socialism and social justice as relate to morals, from law, legislation, and liberty. The ideals of socialism or social justice do not really offer a new moral, but merely appeal to instincts inherited from an earlier type of society. They are an atavism, a vain attempt to impose upon the open society the morals of the tribal society, which, if it prevails, must not only destroy the great society, but would also greatly threaten the survival of the large numbers to which some 300 years of a market order have enabled mankind to grow. In the open or great society, or just open society, millions of people who mostly don't know each other pursue their own interests while sharing a common set of abstract rules. In the tribal society, a small group of no members share common ends, which rely on specific commands to achieve. But the transition from the tribal to the open society required an adjustment to our morals, the extension of the obligation to obey certain rules of just conduct to wider circles, and ultimately to all men must thus lead to a nation of the obligation towards fellow members of the same small group, are inherited or perhaps in part even innate moral emotions are in part applicable to the open society, which is an abstract society. It may at first seem paradoxical that the advance of morals should lead to a reduction of specific obligations toward others, yet whoever believes that the principle of equal treatment of all men, which is probably the only chance for peace, is more important than the special help of divisible suffering, must wish it. Well rooted in instincts, specific obligations or special help for the disadvantaged have become the social justice ideal of a more fair distribution of good things, e.g. wealth. This isn't a problem on a voluntary basis, but redistribution by coercion religion, as in socialism, isn't compatible with the open society because it's at odds equal treatment among other values, including respect for private property, are morals adjusted to the open society through processes of cultural evolution, which proceeds much more slowly than sociological, biological processes, a source of our innate values. Because of this, man still revolts against the new morals, particularly the discipline of freedom, which protects him by impersonal, abstract rules against arbitrary violence of others, and enables each individual to try to build for himself a protected domain with which nobody else is allowed to interfere. That is, there's conflict between human values that we still hold, some which push us towards social justice and socialism, others toward a market-based and open society, and this helps explain socialism's appeal even today. Are you familiar with Hayek's ideas here? What do you think of them? And my thoughts on that are, I personally think the libertarian position is if you want to do socialism among a voluntary, consenting branch of a group, I think you should be able to. But, right now, a lot of people are trying to use the state to enforce socialism. I don't think that's very libertarian. I think libertarian position is, if you want to have your values, you should be able to. If someone else wants to have their values, they should be able to. But they shouldn't try and bully those values on you. And I think that's very much how libertarians view the world. Have whatever values you want to. Just don't try and force them on other people. I guess you could make an argument, well, what about if it's your kids? And I guess, if people do want to push their values on their kids, I guess, they can justify whatever they want to. Same with schools. But, ultimately, I think the libertarian position is, everyone should have their own values. And if people want to take inspiration from other people's values, they should be able to. But you should always try and be true to yourself rather than society as a whole. Don't let society dictate what you are, who you are, and what you believe. And that's my thoughts on that issue. Next, we have students were arrested at the Krom ICE concentration camp after protesting ICE. History shows that when young people organize themselves, power structures begin to shift. This moment follows the pattern. That pattern we will likely only see more young people step up in the future. Listed by Ragnar OKXG, and that's crosspost from the Immigration Pathways subreddit. And yeah, personally, I think calling it a concentration camp is a little hyperbolic, but social media is full of hyperbole. Everyone's always acting like the world is ending. Well, in reality, nothing ever too much does seem to happen. But ultimately, if they want to think it's a concentration camp and that ICE is literally Nazi Germany, they should be able to. But ultimately, if you think ICE is that dangerous, you should be trying to avoid them rather than getting in their face 24/7. But ultimately, just by doing whatever you feel like, I'm sure if ICE was in-group coded rather than out-group coded, Reddit would think it's the greatest thing ever. But since it's out-group coded, Reddit thinks it's the worst thing ever, and that's very much how Reddit works. It only cares about authoritarianism when it's Republican or conservative coded, not when it's Democratic or liberal coded. And that's my thoughts on that issue. Next, we have Trump is losing allies and using a war to distract from Epstein files from MS Now, hosted by The Way to Beauty. And yeah, personally, I don't really care for the war, but I don't really care for the Epstein files either. Eventually people will move on to whatever the next thing is. I've seen the media say, "Oh, Trump's downfall is imminent any day now" for the past 10 years, and at this point, I'll just believe it when I see it. Whenever his downfall does inevitably come, I'm sure eventually people will just move on to whatever the next boogeyman is, whether that be like Nick Fuentes or Tucker Carlson. Or, ultimately people will just move on to, it's always will be whatever the current thing is. Trump's just, he's been the current thing for over a decade now, which is pretty impressive, I must say. It's hard to stay in the news cycle that long as pretty much any one person. You don't see a lot of people, who used to be really in Trump's, from his first term still talked about, and I think it is pretty impressive to stay in the media headlines that long. But eventually, people will just move on to who the next boogeyman is, and then the boogeyman after that, and eventually, that's very much politics for you. Only the names and faces change. The system really doesn't. And I think the libertarian position is we gotta change the system and have a more voluntary collectivist society than the forced collectivist one that we have currently. Next, we have the LP has a point posted by Jai Porcupine, and that's a tweet from the Libertarian Party, and they said they could have just fixed Afro Man's door, and I'd agree with that. I don't think Afro Man should have had his house raided by the police, especially since it was a wrong address raid. But ultimately the police can justify raiding whosever houses they feel like, and oftentimes there's nothing you can do about it. And then he used the footage of that in one of his music videos, and they sued him. But I think he just won his case. So I think the libertarian position is you shouldn't have people enter your house without your consent, I would say, and that includes the state. I don't care if you have dead bodies in your basement. You shouldn't be allowing the state to just come in your home without a warrant. And if they do have a warrant, you don't let them in. You shouldn't be forced to do so. And that's my thoughts on that issue. Next, we have Same Lies, New War, Trump and the Iraq Playbook from Reason.com, posted by Jedi Porcupine. And yeah, personally, I do think there's a lot of stuff from the Iraq playbook in this war. No boots on the ground yet. Now, I think boots on the ground will be disastrous for the Republicans, just like they were in regards to Iraq. But I guess we'll have to wait and see if that does end up happening. Next, we have $200 billion war from Reason.com, posted by Jedi Porcupine. And yeah, personally, I don't think we should be spending that much on wars. But ultimately, the government can throw money at whatever it wants to throw money at, and oftentimes there's nothing you can do about it. Next, we have Myth versus Fact, posted by Ambitious Startups, and that's across from the Walkway subreddits. Save America Act, Myth versus Fact. Myth requires U.S. passport to vote only, and then the fact is only requires photo ID when casting vote. And then deployed abroad, U.S. service members can't vote. Fact is keep existing voting procedures for service members. Unconstitutional violations, federalist principles, election, natural relations clause, blah blah. And I guess that's some infographic guy running for Congress in Indiana made. It looks like some Marlon Stutzman. And yeah, personally, I don't really care for the Save America Act, but I don't really care for voting in general. I would say, ultimately the state can justify whatever counts as a vote. Ultimately, that's whatever counts as a vote is going to be inherently subjective at the will of the state. I'm sure a lot of Republicans that they like the Save America Act because it makes the state more likely to justify enforcing vote and passing votes that are more Republican coded. But I'm sure if it was but the Democrats say, oh, it's voter suppression. But ultimately, each party only cares about the vote when it's for them. When the Democrats don't like what the vote is, it's voter suppression. When the Republicans don't like what the vote is, it's electoral fraud. And ultimately those are pretty much both the same thing. And ultimately I think the libertarian position is we gotta get rid of forced collectivist voting altogether. If you want to vote for something among a voluntary group and everyone consents to the vote, and I think that's fine. But right now, we live in a system where the positions of state authority are determined by a vote, and I don't think that's very libertarian. I think the libertarian position is for a more voluntary state rather than the forced collectivist one that we have currently. And then there was a post from the Libertarian Party USA subreddit I did that I wanted to share as well. Libertarian Perspectives on Money. And I said, so I'm at the LPPA convention today, and we got something on our tables about how getting rid of the penny is the first step on the road to a digital currency, and eventually a CBDC and a Chinese-style social credit system. I personally think that this is a bit overly alarmist. What isn't these days, though, especially when it comes to social media, I should add. But I do agree that a centralized social credit system is very anti-libertarian. The big problem with money and a few other things like language and time is that they basically require as centralized system as possible for ease of access between people. Centralized systems are kind of inherently anti-liberty, but as I said earlier, you do need them. Sometimes you do have some ways to get around them with things like Bitcoin and other cryptocurrencies in regards to money. And I said, I shared pictures of the hand that we got for those curious, and I linked to a post I made to X, and I said, won't be a Libertarian Party convention about an IRL schizo post. And that was they gave us some pennies, and it was a note. It said the penny scam, just so you know, there is no shortage, and it's pretty much just the average schizo post. But the Libertarian Party is very much a schizo posting party, I should say. So ultimately, if people do want to think the penny is going to lead to a central bank digital currency, or getting rid of the penny, I should say, is going to lead to central bank digital bank currency. They should be able to think that, think whatever you want to, and share whatever your thoughts is if you want to. But ultimately, I think the libertarian position is we gotta get the state out of money altogether. It's like we gotta get the state out of everything else. I personally think bartering. A lot of people say we shouldn't be bartering, that's why we have money in the first place, but ultimately bartering does in a lot of respect lead to a less state control over money and allows people to exchange resources between themselves without fearing the state control over it. I think that's important to realize as well. Ultimately, so cryptocurrency and Bitcoin, they're another way around state control of money. But ultimately, I think the libertarian position is, we gotta decentralize something, even it might be hard to decentralize, whether it be money, language, or time. Those are three really hard ones to decentralize because, for ease of access between people, you're gonna have whatever the general time conception is, the general money conception is, and the general language conception is. So ultimately, ultimately say whatever you want to, if you don't like it, you're always free to start your own money system, language, or times frame. And that's my thoughts on that issue. So I think we're gonna wrap it up there. I'll see you guys in the next episode. Bye.